Hi, it's Emily Freitag, and I'm so excited today to be talking to Stephen Butschi and Vivek Chachcha at Google. We are going to talk about AI in action and the service offerings or the product offerings coming out of Google and what the team knows about how they're being used and the range of directions that they're exploring. So thank you both for being part of this tour. We've talked to a lot of different super users that use Google Classrooms and Gemini, and we are excited to hear more from you directly. So as we always do, let's start with you two as people. So Stephen and Vivek, if you could both introduce yourself, tell us your role within Google and how you came to this.
Happy to kick it off. My name is Stephen Butschi, and I'm the director of our education team in North America for go-to-market efforts. So anything that goes into classrooms, whether it's devices or software like Google Classroom, Google Workspace, Gemini. And I actually started at Google 16 years ago working in education, which I feel like is rare. And it was when colleges were thinking about using Gmail for student email as a replacement for on-premise servers. And it's amazing how technology has changed in 16 years. So great to be here today. Vivek, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm Vivek. I'm a product manager on the EDU team where I have been for the last 5-ish years. Prior to that, I was in ads at Google, and prior to that, I used to work in the B2B space in a social media platform, actually. And yes, I think my connection to education actually started way, way before that. I always personally struggled with conventional education, and so it was a bit of a personal interest growing up in the alternative education space and how we can make the existing education systems better for learners of different backgrounds and different needs. So very excited to have come full circle back into the education space.
Thanks for sharing a little bit about your stories. So let's just orient because Google's obviously such a big company, and I think people know parts of Google, but may not know all of the different offerings with schools. So can you tell us like how you see the universe of Google offerings and what you know about sort of rates of usage in schools?
Yeah, I will kick it off here. And that we, as I mentioned, we have a plethora of offerings from devices to software. And what we're finding is that schools are increasingly using this, especially with AI, on how can we allow educators to personalize instruction and also save time because we know that educators do not nearly have enough hours in the day for everything that they need to get done. And on the flip side, to what Vivek was mentioning, how can we allow students to learn in different ways and take content? So, for example, that you have in one format like text and be able to remix it and make it into a podcast or turn it into an infographic. I was just trying to learn VLOOKUPs and I realized that Gemini and creating an infographic was it, or even XLOOKUPs, which is now a thing I've learned, is even more beneficial. And so there's really a ton of power in terms of the ability to use AI for the multimodality capabilities. And we're seeing now as people get even more advanced, they're even starting to vibe code and create their own applications. And so one thing we'll be able to show you later is how people are using Gemini Canvas to vibe code apps. For example, a teacher might be thinking about a lesson they're preparing for the next day and they want to have an engaging activity. Maybe they want to build a Jeopardy board and that would have taken hours and now you can do it in 5 minutes with just English language. So a great way of showing that there's a wide repertoire of a whole bunch of things you can do with AI and with Google tools, and we're seeing them applied in many different ways.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I just wanted to jump
Vivek,
in.
what
I
would you
think
add?
it's I think you laid it out very well, Stephen, in terms of the various pillars that we're seeing in terms of the usage and the use cases that are coming up. I think what's interesting, and I want to answer a bit more pointedly your question, Emily, around the products and like kind of the lists, right? It's like a plethora of tools. How do educators and students even think about which one to use at what point? Um, and we are, I would still say, like on the earlier stages of the generative AI rocket ship, right? The proliferation of tools that we're seeing is an indicator that not just Google, but across the industry, folks are trying to figure out the best way to use the generative AI capabilities that keep increasing and improving week over week. And so within the Google ecosystem, we have our workspace suite, which has docs, sheets, slides, etc. All these products that all of our educators and students are very familiar with. We're seeing the embodiment of generative AI directly within those workflows. We're starting to see generative AI come across the classroom workflow, so Google Classroom, thinking about how teachers create assignments, distribute them, how students get feedback on them. So throughout that end-to-end user cycle, we're seeing a lot of generative AI where abilities in areas where generative AI can help. And then beyond that, labs.google.com is honestly a really fun website to always check in once in a while to see what Google is trying out. It is the latest and greatest and bleeding edge products where Google is experimenting with what AI can do. And so, one of the things that recently came out, recent meaning a month ago, which means probably dated now, is out of Google DeepMind was a product to build worlds, right? And so you can describe the concept that you may have as a story writer or just as an imagination exercise, and Gemini can create an entire world for you to explore. And so that's really where we're seeing the frontier of our AI models and the capabilities therein.
And some people may have heard of DeepMind and some people haven't. So Google as a company has a set of education products, and DeepMind's a different division within the Google universe. Is that right? Do you want to just orient us to DeepMind for a second?
Yeah, it's a tough question, candidly. The Google umbrella is very broad, and DeepMind is a company that Google acquired many years ago now and has been a driving force in our AI efforts. They are the team responsible behind a lot of the research, behind the Gemini models, and like a lot of the research has gone behind that. To bring it back into the education space, the easiest way that I like to think about it is as an educator or a student, when you sign up with Google as an education account, that is really your gateway to the rest of Google, right? And then beyond that, it's kind of irrelevant which sub team then creates the products and is responsible for driving it. Once you're within the ecosystem of Google, you then start getting access to everything that we're building. And it comes again, it's a gradient of where are the products in their life cycles, how mature are they experiments versus long-term kind of investments. And so there's definitely a range within it. But from like an educator lens, you sign in with your school provided account and you can kind of then explore the world that is within Google.
World within Google. Okay, thank you. So let's stay in that lane then, and would love to understand kind of what kinds of uses you're seeing educators value the most. And feel free to show us demonstrations of anything that you think would help understand those use cases.
Perhaps I can jump right into Google Classroom and I will share my screen where we're seeing a couple of different things around that point of saving teachers time. We were working with Albuquerque schools in New Mexico, and they were mentioning through tools leveraging Gemini and other AI tools that Google is offering, they were able to take what could be hours of prep on a Sunday evening. I think that they were able to move what one educator went from 4 hours of prep to about 20 minutes. So they could spend more time actually with their families and thinking about the social connections of humans. And the way that we've been working on making that very accessible is creating these pieces in Google Classroom where you can quickly say, hey, I want to outline a lesson plan. And so let's say that I'm teaching about fourth grade math and I want to talk about multiplication. I could even upload from my drive if I have certain materials, for example, state standards that I want this to pull in. So that way I'm ensure that AI is grounded in my particular curriculum. And then it can go in and create learning objectives and help refine what do we think students will want to learn there. And then you can generate a lesson plan. But even more importantly, you might have certain students in your class that might have specific needs. So for example, please tailor this for a student who has autism. And so this lesson plan can then contextualize all those different needs and add them into a potential draft that you might want to use. And we always believe that humans are not only in the loop, but in the lead. And educators know their class extremely well. And so they should double check everything that's coming out here and make tweaks for what they see is really important for their students and for their class. So that's one example of quickly creating a lesson plan. But then as we go deeper into this, you could create quizzes, for example. So once again, let's say I want to create a multiplication quiz for my fourth graders and make sure that they understand what I've been teaching them. We can quickly, similarly, we could take the learning objectives that we had before. We can choose the type of questions and quickly generate those questions. That is a great example of something that might have taken a while to develop, and now with AI, it's quickly you're easily able to do that. Additionally, one other thing that I would call out as well is the ability to use infographics. So we were talking about multimodality earlier, and so let's say that I am in a class. I'll do once again fourth grade multiplication, and I want to create a give me a infographic to help me understand math at the fourth grade level for multiplication. And this will then bring into Gemini and start creating an infographic where we know that some learners want to see something visual to help them understand how that is working. So these are just a couple of quick examples where we're seeing students leverage this within Google Classroom, that their teachers have given them assignments. So Vivek, I don't know if there's a couple of other ways.
Can we just understand sort of the deployment equivalent for a lesson like this? You said teachers in the lead. Are there situations where they can then assign that directly to students through Google Classrooms? How does it actually, what do kids interact with?
Yeah.
What are the options teachers have for what kids interact with?
Yeah, that's a great point. And we actually are in the process. We'll be launching at ISTE some new features where teachers can assign out these assignments, and they can also say one thing that's really important and that we've been focused on at Google is not just taking a consumer product and slapping education on it, but more so how can we develop for the classroom specifically. And so one thing that we built was this piece called guided learning, and it's built by looking at what's great learning science principles and how can we embed that in. So in a consumer space, you might say, what's 20 times 4? And you want to know the answer is 80 right away. But obviously, the best tutors or the best teachers that you've had, they don't just give you the answer right away. They help walk you through the process. And so one thing that
guided learning, this is, I'm bringing some background knowledge into this, but I think this is almost like a different orientation of the LLM at the base level coming out of DeepMind. Is that right? And it's kind of a mode you can use. Tell us more there.
Yes. So if, for example, when I am learning with guided learning, it's going to break apart the problem and not just give me the answer, but help me break it down in a Socratic method. So thinking about, for example, how to stimulate my curiosity or how to deepen my metacognition. So when I select guided learning here, and then I ask what is 20 times 4, it should then, within the model that's built on these learning principles, it's going to work through this problem together with me. So here it is it's saying I can be thought of as a number of 2 times 4. So looking at the base number and taking off that extra 0. So it's walking me through what's 2 times 4. That's 8. And then from there, it's going to help me understand, okay, great. Now let's get back to the original problem. So you'll see it's similar to a Socratic method of really engaging the user and helping break down the problem as opposed to just giving the answer. So that would be how it shows. And what we're going to be launching at ISTE is the ability for a teacher to assign that within Google Classroom and keep them in that guided learning mode. So that way they're not just getting
kind of like control the mode of Gemini.
Exactly. That's right.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another way that we're seeing folks engage and using that. And then we also, I mentioned earlier, where we've got educators that are using even some vibe coding capabilities. So for example, if I go into Gemini and I say, I am teaching about the US Revolution, create a Jeopardy game for my students in 10th grade. And I can come into Google Canvas or Gemini Canvas here. And then when I ask, I don't know how to code, but this is going to take my English language, start to turn that into code. And you'll see here it's defining the tech stack and then developing the content. And what's great is as it develops this code, it'll show me the code too. So I can actually take that code and embed it, for example, on a Google site. And additionally, here it is, it's complete in the HTML file. And then I can also tweak it. So if I say I don't like these questions, I want to change out some of the questions, it'll allow me to do that as well. So this is a great way for educators who want to start to develop their own applications in their class to be able to engage in new ways that would have taken different skills before.
What about student use of some of the vibe coding capabilities? Is that something teachers can assign? And what do you know about how that's getting used?
Absolutely. So educators can assign assignments through Gemini, whether it be in Google Classroom or others. Like I mentioned before, they could force something like a guided learning experience where it's going to maintain that Socratic method, or they could they could allow them to have full access to that Gemini experience. And when users are under 18, we still maintain the fact that they've got the right safeguards and they have a different experience than those who are over 18.
Mhm. Great. What else should we know about kind of what schools are using Google to do?
Yeah. So a lot of the conversation and the demos that Stephen walked through are a lot of our teacher-led initiatives, right? So we believe that teachers always need to be in the loop. We want to make sure that teachers can drive that initiative and drive the direction of the students' learning. But sometimes, students also need to self-guide their learning. They have their own ways that they want to approach a problem. They have different questions that they want to try to get answers to. And so we also want to make sure we're serving the students appropriately and where possible. And so one of the ways that we're doing that is through practice exams in Gemini. So you may have actually heard we have a lot of standardized tests available now directly within the Gemini application. And so if you're preparing your high school student in the US, preparing for your college exams and entrances, you're looking for the SATs. And so previously you would have to go purchase additional textbooks. Maybe you're going for a tutoring or you're going to private classes to prep for those SATs. Now with Gemini, we're making, in partnership with Princeton Review, we're making available these SAT test prep exams directly available through Gemini. So you could go to gemini.google.com and you can say, hey, I have my SATs coming up. Can you give me a practice exam? And we'll prepare that and show it to you directly in Gemini. You can walk through it. It's a very interactive experience. So you have the multiple
Does it grade
choice.
it for you
Yep,
directly?
exactly. And then it gives you feedback. Like, once you're done the exam, you can review it and it'll give you feedback like, this was the wrong answer. And here is why. This answer was close, but incorrect because of this. And so it also helps them kind of walk through
Mhm.
and learn from their mistakes as opposed to just right wrong. So let me actually use that as a segue to talk about Notebook LM. And
Yeah,
so I can pull that up as well.
I think this is the tool we've heard the most about from teachers. I think there's a lot of Notebook LM
Yeah.
happening.
There's a lot of excitement and for good reason, right? Notebook LM gives the creator, right, which is most often the teachers, the ability to control the content which the experience is grounded on. And that is a really, really big and important thing for teachers. And so in this example here, I've created a notebook called Fundamentals of Nursing, Chapter 10. So I've gone to OpenStax, looked at one of their Fundamentals of Nursing textbooks, and I've pulled in all of their Chapter 10 sections into this one notebook. So let's say I'm a nursing student, we're in week 10, this is what we're studying, and I have some questions. I'm doing my assignment, I have my notes, but I just can't remember this one thing that I remember hearing in class, but I'm not sure on. Having Notebook LM as a study partner to you means you can go in here, you can ask questions. And so if, let's say, I didn't remember what infection cycle meant in like the larger context of patient safety, and I asked that question, it'll give me a response, but very importantly, it gives me that response based on the materials. And so, especially when you start factoring in regional differences, globalization, like there's a lot of different answers that may be relevant for you depending on the context of what you're studying, where you're studying it, and when you're studying it. And so, Notebook LM allows you to do that with that context in mind. And
So
then
does it still draw from training guidance that's been trained on lots of things, or does it really only draw from the source material you've given it?
it draws from the source material that you provided it. So the LLM that powers it, right, is still trained on a very vast amount of data because that's how it unlearns the relationship between the words and kind of how to make sentences in the first place.
Yeah.
But it is then grounded on the sources you provided, and you're basically saying any answers that you provide should be based on this material. And if it cannot find material, then it will say, I don't actually see something about blank. So if I start asking it how to bake a cookie, and I've only given it chapters on nursing, it will respond and say, I don't know how to do that. And so that's the really critical piece about NotebookLM. The other almost equally important piece, I would argue, is the ability to transform this content, right? And so going back to my initial excitement about EDU and my personal story about learning alternatively, when you have all of these resources, which are often text-based, if you do not learn well with text, it is very important to give students the ability to learn in different formats, right? And so you can create podcasts, you can create a video, you can create flashcards, you can create mind maps. And so in here, for example, let's take a look at this flashcard. This is a very quick and easy way for me to start testing myself. After I've read through the materials, these flashcards just help me ascertain for myself, like, am I getting it? Am I not getting it? And I can kind of see the answer as I go through this. If I get it right, I can kind of track myself that I got it. And so over time, NotebookLM also understands how well are you understanding the material that you are looking at here, that you're trying to learn. But beyond that, the podcast is one that initially NotebookLM was extremely popular for, the ability to learn on
And that
the
is
go.
what we've heard a lot of teachers using with students, some for homework, some in class.
And it makes sense, right? Like it's a lot more engaging as a content format when there is dialogue, when there's back and forth. And a lot, especially now for younger learners, we're so used to audio format, video formats. Having that kind of more audio visual experience is critical for them to stay engaged. And so, which is why we actually invested in this video overviews as well, right? So it takes the
what
audio.
does that do? I'm curious.
Yeah, so let's take a look. Let's see if it can hear. The idea here is to actually, I'll just let it do it.
I don't think we can hear the audio.
Okay, so I can voice over it then. Let me. So the idea here is essentially to have audio-visual experience that actually transforms the content that you've given it into something that is a video that you can watch and basically learn most of the content from it. And so in here, it creates an overview of all of these chapters, and it talks about the different infection cycles, how they may happen. It's talking about the health course.
Just to name the obvious, like, first of all, people watching should know we don't have the audio sharing on, so there is an audio component. But this, I assume, is using Gemini to generate this video. Is that the right assumption? So it's like an AI generated video that then takes that same content.
That's right. It's similar to the podcast generation, right? The idea is to take, again, grounded on the same content, but how do you make it into a different format that can be more engaging for students? And so with the audio version, the idea was a podcast is, by and far the most engaging type of audio content that we're seeing nowadays. So if we can, transform a bunch of text into a podcast format, now students and learners would probably listen to that and engage with it more. And here the content format is similar to a lot of videos, educational videos that we see on YouTube, right? Formats where you've taken content, they are supported by graphics primarily. So that's kind of what we're seeing here. And as throughout, it uses diagrams to explain the relationships between the different concepts that you're trying to understand. And so it kind of goes beyond that additional of, okay, you're telling me that there's a relationship, but when you can show me what the relationship between these two ideas is, I will remember it better because I've seen it with my eyes. So that's the delta that we're trying to tap into.
And just so we understand access, NotebookLM, is this like free for anyone? Do you need a school enterprise account in order to have this kind of capability for students?
It's available completely free for everyone, including for students at home if they want to use their Gmail account. If you are using your educational account, you also have access. One thing that I will add is that, within the educational context, and so if you're using your school provided account, and we know because you're using it for learning purposes, we have a number of additional enterprise protections that we apply across the data. And so we always encourage both teachers and students to use their school accounts when they're using Notebook, Gemini, any of our AI tools, any tools actually for educational purposes.
And I think that's important to reiterate, Emily, that we have this free tier with FERPA protections, with data protection, so that way everyone has equity of access as opposed to having to pay for those sorts of data protections.
Well, while we're on the note of data protections, Stephen, when we talked, I was sort of fascinated to understand how little you all actually know about what's being used because your data protections are so tight. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you do know about what gets used and what you don't?
We learn a lot about what gets used through conversations and people telling us. In fact, we were just talking to Florida State University, and they were telling us how a student was using Notebook LM and went from a C average to an A average in their course. And so it's interesting because we do have really tight data protections, and that we, your data when it's in your school account is your data. We don't have access to that, and so we don't necessarily have all the visibility, but it's great to have conversations with folks because they're telling us a lot. And that's how we find out about these use cases, which, by the way, I should close the loop with you and show you the Jeopardy game that was while Vivek was chatting. Here is our Jeopardy game so we can quiz ourselves. But what I love about this, it shows all the code so you can embed this on a sheet. But here's, for the 10th grade social studies teacher, we've got our Jeopardy items, causes and acts for 100, for example. The 1765 tax placed on all the printed papers. Do you remember your history?
Oh gosh, you're actually asking me this question.
It's okay. I'll let you tweet the stamp back.
Stamp back.
All right. We'll go back then. Maybe this will be a little bit easier. The 4th grade infographic that we were chatting about. Here's our multiplication infographic to help students understand what is multiplication. And as you see here, it's visualizing some of the rows and the columns to understand how multiplication works. So these are all great examples that we've actually gotten through conversations with schools and educators where they're telling us this is where it's really making a difference in our students' academic progression and where it's helping our educators save time.
So thank you for showing us that. That is exciting. I had a mental question. Is it going to talk about arrays? And I'm glad it did. My nerdy math mind. So I'd love to level out a little bit and just understand how you all think about impact. Like, what impact are you hoping the various products that Google develops for students, particularly within school? That's a little bit more of our lane of focus, but obviously you all are thinking deeply about direct to learner interaction. What impact are you hoping it will have, and how do you know about how it's doing against that aspiration?
Yeah, we've referenced a few of them throughout our time chatting today. I think one is how can we save educators time? And so we've been working across a lot of different pilots. And for example, in Northern Ireland, they were doing a pilot and they were finding that it was using Gemini was helping educators save about 10 hours a week across 600 different use cases. Or I mentioned Albuquerque schools where they were taking lesson planning time from 4 hours on a Sunday to 20 minutes. We also saw at Oxford University that in a 6-month pilot, 85% of participating colleagues saw measurable productivity gains across tools like using Gemini and Notebook LM. So I think one is how do we save time so we can actually reinforce the human connection? We can spend time with each other as humans and support that. And the second is how can we increase learning? And so we've been doing some studies. There was one out of the UK that had a randomized trial of 165 students that were ages 13 to 15. And they were using things like guided learning, which is powered by LearnLM and Gemini for math tutoring. And they were 5.5 percentage points more likely to solve novel problems independently. Or one that just came out in Sierra Leone around mathematics, speaking of mathematics and multiplication, where they're looking at secondary students and they saw a gain of 0.258 standard deviations in their math scores, which is about 1.2 to 1.7 years of typical learning process progress that was achieved within this 8-week trial. And so we're finding that this is the ability to help students learn and at the right pace and learn quickly, and also give educators time so they can support those students in that learning process, I think is ultimately what success looks like.
And it comes across very clear that you think teachers should not only be in the loop, but in the lead. I think that's
Yeah.
a sticky phrase. And it seems to me like you're building a lot of functionality that teachers then decide how to use in lots of different flexible ways. Are there any, there's obviously guardrails in terms of student data and privacy that you've talked a little bit about. That's not as much the focus of this tour as is instruction. So I'm not going into as much depth on that, but I know that you all have thought deeply about this, and I'm sure there are resources that people can learn a whole lot more. But I think I'm interested in the instructional guardrails. Are there certain uses that you think are actually not helpful to the learning aims that get edited out at the product level? Or is it like that's the job of the teacher? We're going to supply a broad range of usage and they will make those decisions.
Well, I think when we were developing, Vivek, feel free to chime in, but when we were looking at guided learning, we were trying to figure out what does a great tutor or a great teacher do. And one example of that is they don't just give you the answer right away. They're trying to stimulate your curiosity. They're trying to help personalize that content to you and so you can ingest it, et cetera. And so the key for us is how then do we make that as a toggle within Gemini that teachers then can control and say, I want you to have this specific Socratic experience in the class. But I think that you're right that the educator should be at the core of all of that and making those decisions. And our goal is to give tools. For example, part of the thing that we'll be launching around assigning out guided learning is insights for teachers. So where are students getting stuck in that process? How many of them are engaging? So that way they can use that information to better tailor how they want to use technology in the class and when it's appropriate and when it's not. And that's why just like everything, it's a balance. You want to use it when it really supports your curriculum and your goals, but it shouldn't take away from the social and human connection of the learning process because we know that's so important. I mean, if you go back to when you first learn to tie your shoe, you're probably like, Mom, Dad, or Aunt or Uncle, whoever it is, like, look, and they're like, oh, let me help you adjust that knot. And it's that feedback process that's so important and the emotional process of learning something and getting recognition, et cetera. And so while I think a lot of the use cases that we've shown are there to help extend that the teacher, because unfortunately we don't have a one-to-one ratio in schools, but instead it's to allow students to start to individualize and personalize some of that learning while also reinforcing the social connection of that learning.
Mhm. What would you add, Vivek?
It's hard to follow up. I think Stephen covered a lot of it. I think the other thing I'll add, is that again, we're early stages in this overall cycle, right? And so that's part of the reason that we are heavily invested in two areas. We are investing a lot in educator upskill, right? So there's a lot of curriculum, a lot of programs that we're investing in to make sure that educators are getting the training they need on these new AI tools and how to use them effectively, both for themselves, but also for with their students, right? Because then they're going to then teach their students. The other area we're investing a lot in is these randomized control trials. We want to measure the impact of the work that we're doing. So we're running a lot of partnerships programs. I think Stephen mentioned a few with Northern Ireland on Albuquerque. We also have some in the UK where and Sierra Leone, I think we recently did as well. And so the idea with all this is to continue to measure the impact that we're seeing. I think you can hypothesize like this is what we think is going to happen, and then seeing in practicality and measuring it is where we're investing a lot.
And let's talk about cognitive offloading and cheating, because I think those are deep concerns for parents, for educators, and for kids. Um, and I have seen certainly in multiple different instances this year, kids, go to their browser, which is sometimes Google, and like sort of get a quick answer to something that they then put into a different AI tool to then, complete the answer. Um, that's obviously not just a Google challenge, but it is part of the functionality in Gemini outside of that guided learning mode. I obviously we can see that as some evidence of something that you're trying to do to control that usage, but what would you say to people that would prefer to just sort of chuck it all and because they're so worried about the risks that kids are facing by not having to do the hard cognitive work of getting to complex answers on their own.
Yeah, it's a great question. And one, I think first is understanding that cognitive offloading, or I've heard cognitive surrender. And what is, I'll give you an example of maybe some positive cognitive offloading is I used to know all of my friends, my family, my parents, my school phone numbers by heart. I probably know like five now because I have a cell phone that stores all of the other ones. And I need to know a few for emergencies, but that's freed up my brain to think
Yeah.
about and learn other things. And so I think that to your point, the role of the educator of understanding what is important and as part of the curriculum that they're teaching, what skills are really critical that we need to ensure that there is strong grasps of that curriculum by our students. And that's why from our perspective is how do we create different tools that educators can use in different ways. And I think about we have a responsibility there. And then educators, where they're really strong, is in the scaffolding and the norms. And a great analogy that one of my colleagues was mentioning is we give students scissors. These are essentially two knives, held together, and they can be very dangerous. But schools have learned that it's an important skill set to develop and an important tool to become productive, as opposed to trying to pull things apart or rip things or whatever it may be. But they've thought about how do they one get the right scissors. So, for example, they've scaffolded that in kindergarten they're getting dulled edges and they're smaller scissors, and then they're also norming the right behavior, like you need to walk with them in a certain way, you need to put them away in a certain way. And so I think it's working together between educators and tech providers like Google to say what are those product designs that you need in order to build the right scaffolding and the right norms to ensure that these tools can be used effectively and help students gain skills that they will use later on and become productive and at the right speed and at the right time. And I think that that's we're fortunate we have a lot of great education partners along that journey with us, and it's a great feedback loop.
Mhm. Great. Final question. Any product edges or kind of new frontiers that you want people to know are coming next? We hear often that this is all moving so fast, and that's a big opportunity and also a challenge for some metabolizing and digestion. But tell us about what's coming next.
Yeah, it's a great question, right? I think going back to you've heard this theme, many times in this conversation alone, this idea of teacher-led and teacher in the loop. And there are two areas that we've invested a lot into previously. So one was making sure teachers are in the loop and they're having, initiating the workflows that trigger AI in the conversation. The second one is more around grounding. So making sure that teachers have the ability to ground the context of their course, their class, whatever they're teaching, and how they want to teach it directly into that experience. So we see that with Notebook LM. We've seen that with Notebook LM already within Google Classroom available today as well. And this last piece is an area that we have invested in, but is probably going to be an area of focus for probably another year or so, right, at the minimum. And this is creating the final step, which is creating the feedback loop back to the teachers, right? So in this idea, I'm a teacher, I've created an AI resource, whatever that may look like. I've decided to ground it in the experience and the curriculum and the material that I want. Now I've distributed it to my students. But now what's happening? I don't know how my students are engaging with it. What are they asking? What are they not understanding? And so making sure we complete that loop and making sure that teachers get visibility both at the student granular level, but also holistically, right? To say, okay, across my class, 50% of my students are not understanding this concept that I taught last year. And I can see that because they're asking questions about it consistently. That tells me as a teacher that I need to address that next time. And so the next time we're meeting, I can now talk about it again. And so these are the kind of insights that I think are really important for us to feed back to teachers. That helps them improve their own usage of the tools. It helps them course correct what they're teaching in class. And so that's where we're going to end up focusing a lot.
Awesome. Well, uh, I don't think you mentioned your reach, but I believe, maybe this is a question, not a comment. Tell us about reach in schools overall.
Yeah, we have between our workspace products, so think about Google Docs and Gmail, et cetera. We have over 170 million educators and students using them worldwide, and some of them are using Gemini as part of that, et cetera. And we have in the United States alone, over, at least in the higher education space, I believe over 10 million students now have access to Gemini in colleges and universities across the United States. So we're working to ensure people are aware of all the free data protected tools available to them. And as well, Vivek mentioned a really important piece, the professional development that comes along with that. And we've made a commitment in the United States to ensure that all 6 million educators, both in higher ed and K-12, have access to AI literacy content. And we're going to be, we have badges so they can collect them. I believe we have 20 modules now. We'll be adding more. And so as folks are wanting to get deeper into content, things like what is vibe coding? How do I create those Jeopardy apps? They now have more resources. It's free and available on demand, as well as we'll have in-person training. So we are working to, as much as possible, to ensure people are aware of what's available and that they also have skills to take advantage of them.
Lots of kids, lots of teachers, and lots to learn, I can tell. We look forward to continuing to learn together, and we'll check back in later in the tour because I'm sure some of these tools will already be brought to market and we'll want to know more.
Thank you so much, Emily. It was great to join you today.
Thank you
Thank you
both
for
for
having
joining
us.
us.